Hi everyone, welcome back. I want to talk today about the community around Classic Plus, about how sometimes it feels like people can be a little bit defensive when you make suggestions about what you want Classic Plus to be. It seems like the stakes are really high and emotions and tensions can be a little bit high sometimes if you make suggestions people disagree with. And I know there are always members of the community who take things a little bit too far when things change in the game or whatever, but it feels like this time is a little bit different. Like people are really worried that Classic Plus might not be for them. The uncertainty is really weighing on people. So I want to take this video as a chance to take stock of the different parts of the community, the reasons that people might be feeling a lot of anxiety around potential announcements. BlizzCon's just a few weeks away, so I think now's a very interesting time. I wanted to talk about what the feelings are like now, since I think things could be different after BlizzCon. This will be a fun little time capsule into what the community sentiment was like in the couple weeks leading up to BlizzCon, as before we knew anything about Classic Plus. Hopefully we get a whole bunch of details and everyone's happy on the other side of BlizzCon, but I've got a feeling there'll be entirely new topics to discuss, way less abstract, so let's get into it. I think the core of people's anxiety around Classic Plus comes down to who the game is for. There are so many different segments of WoW players who have different desires, different things that they want out of the game, different ways that they want to engage with the game, that it's easy to imagine the game being focused on one segment and maybe neglecting another. And I think the existence of Classic really makes it obvious that this could happen, right? There are a lot of people who really identify with Classic as their main version of WoW who really don't like the direction that retail has gone. That's not a controversial thing to say, because it's easy to see how retail has gone down a road that they don't like. People who do like the classic versions of the game are afraid that Classic Plus might go down some of those roads as well, or even just not the version that they like. And something I think a lot about when I'm kind of categorizing the community is just how many different versions of Classic there are. It's easy to think about WoW as two games, retail and Classic, and a lot of times Blizzard or content creators kind of categorize the community this way. But I think that the Classic community has got a lot more breadth than that. There are so many different versions of Classic. Of course, there's the Mist of Pandaria progression servers. There's Anniversary doing its own progression thing. There's Hardcore. There's Era, Season of Discovery that you can still play if you want. There are so many different ways to play Classic, and I think considering all those different versions of the game, one game, is a little bit of a mistake. I think that they do different things in the same way that retail and Classic, retail and any one of them do different things. Each version of Classic has differences as well. So it's easy to imagine, do you want Classic Plus to be more like Wrath, or do you want it to be more like Vanilla? People might have different answers for that, and it's easy to imagine how someone could feel left out, or feel like they might get left out if Blizzard chooses one that they're not happy about. So at the core, I think it's about fear that Classic Plus might not be for me, even though I really want it to be for me. If you're here watching this video, odds are you're excited about Classic Plus. You're really hopeful that it's going to be something that you want to spend a lot of time on, a game that makes you really happy to spend time playing it. I hope it is for myself. I hope it is for you. This hype period leading up to a game's announcement can be really exciting, so it's easy to get emotionally invested in what's to come. So for the rest of this video, I'd like to talk about the different segments of the community as I see it. I'm going to talk kind of broadly about the different versions of WoW, and also about the different types of players that I most associate with each version. There is a lot of crossover, obviously, within the Classic community of people who play more than one version of Classic. So first, I'd like to talk about the progression realms, both Mists of Pandaria and Anniversary. And I associate these versions of Classic most with people who are interested in progression style raiding, doing the latest raid content on every new phase. A lot of content creators around Classic WoW tend to focus on these versions. They lend themselves well to content because there's new things coming out every so often, and a lot of the discussion in these parts of the communities tend to focus around raiding. Like, I think there's a lot of discussion around the cost of consumables in Burning Crusade right now, things like that. So I kind of see this as a very raid-focused population, and I do think that there's a lot of opinions from this part of the community around how raids should work in Classic Plus. I think that it's a diverse enough set of opinions, and I think a flexible enough way to play the game, that it's maybe one of the less sore subjects. I think that because this segment of the community can be such a focal point of content creators, I think it's easy to imagine that Blizzard is aware of them and is going to at least consider this type of player when it comes to Classic Plus. Now, my personal opinion is the Classic Plus is going to lean more into horizontal progression where they try to avoid invalidating old content. And I think that actually is going to be quite disruptive to this kind of raid logging, like latest raid tier playstyle. I made a whole video about this already. You can go back and watch. But if you don't invalidate old content, it really throws a kink in the idea of we're going to make a new raid and it's going to have all the best in slot gear there. You know, everyone's going to need to go raid in that latest one. I think it totally changes the structure of things. So that type of discussion actually is not very prominent right now. In my opinion, I made that video because I thought that it was something that was being under-discussed, and I still think that's the case. So I think that this part of the community is generally feeling pretty comfortable and seen, and if anything, they're maybe the least anxious segment who's kind of expecting Classic Plus to be for them, although we'll see when it comes to BlizzCon if that ends up being the case. Era is, of course, the permanent vanilla server. I've been playing a lot of Era lately. It's been a blast. Playing there has really highlighted to me how different Era feels than every other version of the game, even Burning Crusade. I think the biggest thing for Era players right now is how much will Classic Plus be about vanilla, about the vanilla sensibilities. I think everyone expects there to be no flying, which is definitely the biggest difference between Burning Crusade and vanilla. But things like the ability to summon at summoning stones, I think there's this big question in the community of will Classic Plus be Vanilla Plus, or is it going to be kind of some amalgamation of Vanilla, Burning Crusade, and Wrath, and kind of all the sensibilities there. I think Season of Discovery really led people to believe that the class gameplay might be more in line with Wrath than in line with Vanilla. I think that there's a lot of expectations among maybe non-Era Classic players that will be the case. I've definitely seen a lot of hope among Era players that there are as few changes as possible. I've even kind of jokingly thought to myself that, boy, if you don't want there to be any changes to vanilla, is what you're asking for really just like a vanilla fresh? What would Classic Plus even be if there were no changes, if it was just a re-release of vanilla? But I do think that there are a lot of people around who play Era who would actually just like a fresh Era. I don't think Classic Plus is going to be that way, but I do think that the players who are really attached to vanilla and want the fewest changes find themselves playing Era. But there are other players there as well. I think that the thing that drew me to it is that it really is the embodiment of horizontal progression. How could old content ever get invalidated on Era when there's never any new content there to invalidate it, right? I think that the people who are really attached to vanilla are generally hoping that Classic Plus will be more like vanilla, and I think that this is the place where I have seen the most defensiveness, because I think that there's an expectation among this part of the community that it is going to be more like Wrath, more like retail than a lot of these people think that they want. And I think that this is the place where the most anxiety comes from. Hardcore is maybe the most unique segment of the community. It has the most overlap with other versions of the game. Most people who play Hardcore also play something else. It's very common to pair with the Progression Anniversary servers. There's a lot of content creators who I would say focus on that combination, the Anniversary plus Hardcore. The Hardcore servers are still on vanilla. Some people do play Hardcore on Anniversary, but I think that when I think about the Hardcore community, I think about the official Hardcore vanilla. I think that these players are less attached to every little part of the game design of vanilla and are more open to changes than people who are just on Era. Of course, if your Hardcore character dies, you can move it to an Era server, so there are people on the Era servers who are former Hardcore players, although I think that's actually pretty rare. Most people who die on Hardcore just make a new Hardcore character. I think that there's a lot of expectation that the things that make Hardcore great, the focus on the journey over the destination and trying to make leveling really important, I think people who play a lot of Hardcore expect those values to be represented well in Classic Plus. So I think that this is also maybe a little bit less anxious part of the community. I think that Hardcore players feel really seen because they've gotten a lot of support from Blizzard in getting an official mode. Something that I forgot to mention in the Era section was how I think that part of the community can feel a little bit neglected. That Era feels like the least favorite child of Blizzard in a lot of ways. That occasionally bugs that crop up won't be fixed for a long time. They'll announce some feature is going to kind of get added just as like an afterthought of like, oh yeah, we're going to add dual spec on Era. Obviously, some players really like that, but it always comes with a tone that they didn't do it because they thought the Era players would like it, but because it just happened to work out or whatever. So I think that's where a lot of the Era players' anxieties derive from. And with the hardcore players, I think that I don't think that they feel like they're getting as much attention as retail players get. I think that the fact that hardcore is being acknowledged at all, that they got new servers for Anniversary, I think that people feel like Blizzard acknowledges that community and values the things that they value. The Blizzard thinks the things that make hardcore great are worth designing for in WoW and expect it to be represented in Classic Plus. Lastly, for Classic players anyway, is the tourist, or I kind of also think of this as like the returning player. Somebody who has a lot of history with WoW, but maybe isn't actively playing a lot right now. Someone who might have dipped their toes into Classic 2019, or maybe just played before and could be interested in getting back into WoW. And I think that you do see discussion around the community, people who are like this. Obviously, if you're a content creator, you're probably not like this, although I have seen some videos around people who say that they are excited for Classic Plus, but don't play a lot of Classic right now. So there are content creators out there as well. But mostly you'll see this, on Reddit or on whatever comments of YouTube videos, things like that. People who say they're really excited for Classic Plus, but don't play a lot right now. I would say these players also tend to feel like they're going to be catered to. I think that in a lot of ways, they're kind of the source of anxiety of some of the other groups. I think that players are afraid Blizzard is going to pull out some cheap tricks, some gimmicks, just to try to make a quick buck on getting all these returning players to resubscribe or something like that. And in doing so, they're going to compromise the long-term integrity of the game in some way. So this group can often be looked down upon. I think that the content creators who are really focused on raiding will, often acknowledge that there are people who play but aren't going to be doing a lot of raiding or, might not be putting in the same number of hours that the hardcore players do. I think that it's often seen as an afterthought to these content creators, but I think there's a big question mark around how much does Blizzard see this as a first-class, important part of the player base to cater to. I personally identify a lot with this. I think that content creators tend to skew very heavy towards people who do weekly rating, who focus very much on optimization, and above all else, tend to compare themselves to others to derive their identity within the game. Whereas I'm a player who's always liked to do what I want to do and tried to avoid comparing myself to others really at all if I can. Sometimes in WoW that can be impossible. It's a game where you need to group with other players to do a lot of the content, and everybody knows that occasionally you run into weirdos who will just insist on everyone in their group min-maxing, and they'll spend 5 hours finding the perfect group so they can clear 20 minutes faster. You know the deal. I think this is the most nebulous set of players yet. I think it's maybe one that people don't identify with as much, specifically because, like I said, it's not really a content creator archetype for the most part, which tends to kind of define how the community sees themselves, right? They say, oh, I play similar to this content creator. I like to do the same content that they'd like to do. I think this has less defined boundaries in the other sections. Last is retail. I almost didn't include this section in the video. I've seen some content recently from retail creators talking about Classic Plus, and there are a few concerns that really felt like they fit in this video. The first is, of course, that if Classic Plus becomes this whole supported separate MMO, that it might take away resources from retail. And that worries some retail players, gives them some anxiety. I do think that this is a little bit less of something that's likely to be a fear in the long term. If Classic Plus is its own whole thing and has a separate team, I don't think that people are going to necessarily complain about it. They don't complain when Blizzard makes, a new Diablo 4 expansion or whatever. The second, which I thought was maybe more interesting, was a fear of kind of FOMO over Classic Plus features, specifically around things like new races or classes. Like if they add high elves or ogres as playable races, that retail players might really be upset that they don't have access to those, which I found that to be a very interesting consideration. More so than any of the other concerns I've talked about in this video, I find this to be kind of irrational. I think that there's a lot of people out there who play retail and have become very deeply invested in it. They've played the same character for 20 plus years, and they have all these collections and all these things who can't really imagine spending a lot of time playing Classic. And while I do kind of see how you could end up in this situation, I really don't have that much sympathy for it. I think that there's obviously a lot of great things about Classic WoW, and I think anyone who refuses to even try a version of WoW that's not their preference should probably try to push themselves out of their boundaries and, just try it anyway. I personally try retail every now and then. I've got a lot of interest actually in Delves, and I tried to play Midnight a few months back, but kind of just bounced off of the campaign. But anyway, I think that if you're a retail player who doesn't want to try Classic, who doesn't want to try Classic Plus especially, I think you should give it a shot and stop worrying so much. And that's everyone. BlizzCon is September 12th. I'm hoping we learn a lot more. I'm hoping that everyone kind of gets their way. Maybe there'll be a follow-up video where we talk about which of these types of players got served best. Anyway, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment. The biggest reason for me making these videos is to engage with the people who like to talk about WoW. So if you have any questions, you have anything to add, if you think there's anything that I forgot, please leave a comment. I'm hoping this video will be fun to look back on later down the line once Classic Plus comes out. Subscribe for more Classic Plus content. Thank you so much for watching.